bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey, we're glad you're with us today. This is going to be one of the most valuable podcasts that you listen to. Connor and I are very pleased to have Dale Carson with us today. Dale is the author of Arrest Proof Yourself. And Dale, you come at this from a very unique angle in that you were not only a police officer, but you're also a former FBI agent and now a defense attorney. Tell us a little bit about how that progress took place.
Well, like so much of life, things just happen. They come at you and you end up doing them. And one of the things that I learned over the course of all of this is, law enforcement, we believe as an American generation that law enforcement really is here to serve and protect. Not necessarily in that order, but that's what they're here to do. And certainly law enforcement in Miami back in the 70s, we did both of those things. And I certainly did that in the FBI, but I began to realize kind of an anomaly in what I was doing. And I began to question the tenets of, what does this all mean? I mean, what is really the purpose of law enforcement in an American community? And was that in fact being served or disserved? Mm. And I think that one of the things that really I've discovered in the last couple of years really is that, and of course I knew this all along, but when you're on the inside, you don't really see it from the outside as I do now, being a criminal defense attorney, because the tables are kind of turned on me now in a way that they weren't before. And really the first indicator that I had, frankly, that police officers are different than other standard American citizens was kind of funny. I'll tell you what it was. When I left the police department, I had a feeling, well, how on earth are they going to survive without me doing the things that I did, 5-6 days a week, during shifts, protecting people, arresting criminals, that sort of thing. How are they going to survive? And that was pretty naive because somebody just took my place. I was replaceable, very easily replaceable. But the other oddity was when you're out, you're out. And that became even more evident to me when I was an FBI agent. As soon as you become an FBI agent, even though at the time I had an FBI agent wife, I was out. I was no longer part of that group. And it was then that I really began to realize something that is fundamentally important to your listeners and to all of us as Americans. And that is that police officers, law enforcement officers, are an insular group from all the rest of us. They don't live in the community. They don't participate in the community. For example, I was never invited to a party by people in my communities. No one ever called up on a Friday and said, hey, man, we're having a party. Let's get together and do some blow. We're going to bring some gals over. And to the extent people behave that way in the civilian population, that's certainly a reason not to call me. So, I began to see that police were just not part of the standard American culture. And their behavior has been largely co-opted by government, and their master is no longer the civilians whom they serve and protect. It is, in fact, the government.
Dale, let me jump in. Dale, let me jump in there to ask you a question, because this is what, as I reviewed your book, Arrest Proof Yourself, we'll link to a copy of that on today's show notes page, which is societyandthestate.com/5. We've worked on a lot of policies reforming, police and prosecutors and so forth. And what you're saying strikes me as interesting, because very often the critics, the objections come that we are, anti-police, that anyone who supports reforming the system or restricting, certain authorities and powers of police are therefore anti-police. And what you're driving at, and I want to get your reaction to, is that it's not so much being anti-police as it is anti-policy or anti-government, in the sense that it's the policies, it's the legislators that are creating the system, passing these laws that police are then tasked with doing. So from your perspective, having been an officer and now writing this book where you're helping people understand how they can, quote, arrest proof themselves and know how to interact with police to, protect their rights. Do you perceive that that's a better way to phrase it, that police are almost a sympathetic figure to some degree, that they're just having to then enforce what other people are telling them? Or do you think that that's not the full picture?
No. I think that is the full picture, but it's a hidden picture. It is something that is not patently evident to anyone except someone like yourself who has looked at it for some time, or people, the rare person like myself who's been in a number of different sides of that behavior. Because, we used to be what were known as peace officers.
Right.
Today, we are no longer peace officers. Today, we are law enforcement officers. And you can just read into that everything that it means. They are out there to enforce the laws that the legislators have passed, and they are no longer given the discretion to prosecute, to arrest, or not to arrest. And that's a bigger problem. And it permeates the system in more ways than you possibly know. This concept of police academy, where you get the tools to become a police officer, and Lord knows I've been to a lot of academies, but when you pass through that and you're actually on the street in a training status, you get what is known as a TA, training officer. And I know that means something else in common parlance, but here it means training officer, training advisor, and that person is the one who tells you, you can just about forget what you learned in the academy. Here's how it really works in the world and how you protect yourself from getting fired or getting killed. And that's the person you listen to. So that training advisor, that training officer, TO, is the person who really conveys to the young officers how to survive. Now, what's happened is really kind of bizarre. And it happened in the 70s and 80s. The training officers were changed from being people who told you the truth and protected you, as I mentioned, from not only getting fired but getting killed, to someone who were just simply rule followers. And the reason that happened is really bizarre. It happened because the population generally believed that training officers ought to follow the regime of the actual training school. And that happened simply because the society now was concerned that the officers weren't behaving specifically like they were trained in the police academies. And so the training officer now became a target. So if the training officer didn't follow the rules, the training officer got in trouble. So training officers didn't train the way a police officer should be trained. And let me just explain that a little more. When I was a cop in Miami, I can remember Jim Isley was a training officer. And a lot of these guys had come out of Vietnam, and they've been through the thick of it. I'm not talking about somebody working in maintenance somewhere. I'm talking about being in the rice paddies and getting shot out and killing people.
Right.
So these were tough people. And there were any number of them back in the early 70s who'd come back from Vietnam, and those were our training officers. They didn't give a flip for what the training academy said. They were there to help people because that was their very nature, and they were there to protect us from getting killed. And I can remember being in domestic situations where I turned around and Ising had a woman with a butcher knife pinned up in the corner of a ceiling, and he was holding the butcher knife that she had in her back, and I was walking her husband out the door because they had a domestic, and we would typically take them out the door and we would lecture them. We would say sternly, now, Johnny, don't come back here, because if you come back here tonight, I'm going to have to put you in jail, right? So when we left, Jim took that knife from that woman, promptly flipped it in a canal, and we left. There was no charge of attempted murder. There was none of this stuff because we had the power to behave in a way that stabilized families and created peace, not enforcing the law.
Dale, is this this is the discretion that you were describing earlier, correct?
It is. It is. And today, you would never do that. You would charge that woman with attempted murder, that's what you would do. And you would rescue that knife, and you would store it in evidence, and you would tax the community with having a trial and putting her in jail so she can't support her children. We magnified the problem. We became today law enforcement officers. If you go to a domestic today in Florida, you are required to arrest somebody, and there are special privileges that as a police officer you enjoy of never being prosecuted civilly or criminally for making a bad arrest at a domestic situation.
Okay, I got a question for you, Dale. Let's since we have some constraints of time here, there's a couple things I really want you to touch on. One of them has to do with the electronic plantation. This is a phrase that you use in your book to describe when someone has been arrested. You say that they have been admitted to the electronic plantation. I'd like you to describe why you use that phrase and why it's so important for a person to avoid being arrested in the first place.
Yes. Right. There's a battle going on in the street when you confront an officer. Believe me when I tell you this, they are promoted from street officer to detective based on one primary statistical accomplishment, and that is the number of arrests they make. So when you encounter a police officer, you can best believe, look at Hollywood. Every movie that really makes a big box office hit is about a detective or a police officer on the street, but a detective, not a street officer. So that person wants to be a detective, and they will use you as a statistical accomplishment in order to become that one thing. So police officers, when they're making these arrests, really are in the field not to help you, not to be a peace officer, but to put you in jail so they can become detectives. Now, if you buy off on that, which I'm telling you, that's an absolute fact, you will understand that in the context of being arrested, just arrested, not prosecuted, not convicted, but just being arrested, your name and your fingerprints. If your fingerprints are taken, you are in what I call the electronic plantation, because you are part of the criminal arrest system that most businesses, particularly government entities, have immediate access to. So when you walk into a place, you're going to be checked. If you are determined to be a criminal person under those circumstances, not only are you subject to more arrests, but you are denied employment based on that. Because if an employer looks at your record and goes, wait a minute, you were arrested for armed robbery, and let's just say that it's entirely fictitious. You never did it. You were misidentified. It doesn't make any difference. You are in the system, and people will tell you, we can get it sealed or expunged. That's garbage. Once you're in the federal system, remember there are two entities, sovereigns in this particular case, the sovereign state of Florida and the sovereign federal government. And once you're in NCIC, the National Criminal Index, you're never coming out, ever, ever. There's nothing you can do because one sovereign can't tell another sovereign what to do. So you are in that system, and it can be used to prevent you from getting better employment, from having a right to vote, all nature of things, simply because of an arrest. And if you understand the dynamic that police officers are in the business of putting people in jail, bakers make pies, bricklayers lay walls and bricks, that's what police make arrests. And if you encounter them, you are subject to become an arrested individual, and as a consequence, be restricted in what you can do in the future. If you're arrested and charged with a crime in the United States, you can't go to Australia. I mean, there are various restrictions. You can't have student loans. There are all kinds of things that go on just being arrested, not necessarily convicted.
Dale, this is such an important point that I think the value of your book is such that a lot of people don't understand these issues. They're not aware of them until often, hopefully, they read about it in the news happening to somebody else, right? But in some cases, it happens to them, right? And people, I had no idea. And what about the presumption of innocence? Which, go ahead.
When I was a cop in Miami, all you got to do is follow behind a car. What you forget, and I forget, is that in a lot of the poor elements of society, where there is increased enforcement because that's where the crime is, right, in the poor areas, the only safe place for somebody to keep something that they're proud of or enjoy or want to keep is in the only locked facility that they have available to them, and that's called the trunk of their car. So any car you stop, I walk up to you and I say, hey, young man, let me see your driver's license. And I'm kind to you. I'm not being a jerk. And you say, here, officer. And I look at that license and I say, young man, what are you doing in this area? This is a dangerous area. And you go, oh, I didn't know, officer. And I said, look, you don't have any guns or narcotics in your car, do you? And you look up at me with those young eyes and you say, oh, well, no, officer, I wouldn't have any of those things. And I wait a moment and I go, well, that's really good. You don't mind if I search, do you? And with that sort of mantra, I have opened the trunks of thousands of cars and found hundreds and hundreds of items of contraband, okay? Because people don't know that they can say, officer, you've stopped me for a traffic violation. I understand that. But no, you can't search my car. And I was going to my mother's house, tell the truth here. I was going to the store because when we're in a car, we all forget we're going someplace. And if you're an American, you're late. So it's a truth. Officer, I was late when you stopped me. I'm late now. And can I go, please? And if you don't have those words on the tip of your little golden tongue, you're likely to end up in the electronic plantation because you're uninformed. And you've got to say that. And the officer may look at you and say, well, son, I'm going to have to bring a dog, and we're going to sniff your car. Most of the ghetto cars that I've been exposed to all smell like marijuana. So you go, oh, hell, man, I'm going to jail. But the truth of the matter is, under current law, and this is fairly recent, although it was true in the 70s, we just never acted on it as police officers. You are not allowed to detain somebody over about the length of time it takes to write a ticket. 10, 15 minutes, that's it. And if they keep you beyond that time and search your car and find contraband, any competent lawyer can get the case thrown out. And if you don't do that, you're just asking to be part of that electronic plantation. And it's tough afterwards to get work.
Dale, we've got time for one or two questions. I want to touch on something that you've already touched on and expand it. You talked about how police officers can be motivated. I mean, obviously, there's the general rule and there's exceptions. It's not to indict everyone who wears a badge per se, but these are systemic problems, I think, that you're pointing out that are reflective of the system and the culture. And so you pointed to the number of arrests as kind of this motivator or incentive is the word I would choose to use, an incentive that police officers have to go about interfering in people's business. Where we talk about society and the state here, people are in society going about their business, going to work, doing their own thing. And here comes the state because its agents are incentivized to go and find things and harass people. I want you to touch on other incentives, right? People know about quotas and they know about, civil asset forfeiture and how police officers in many states are able to keep the money that they receive. Talk broadly about incentives and why you think that's a problem for police officers trying to interfere in people's business.
Have you ever been on a sports team? Have you ever been on a sports team?
Oh, it's been years.
Okay, but you were. What kind of sport team were you on?
Let's see. There was Little League.
There you go.
All right, we'll use Little League.
Sure. All right. When we get older, remember that cops work on squads, and they are young, testosterone charged, except for the girls, obviously, employees of the state. And they challenge one another to be better than the other cops. I mean, that's the way it works. It's a team effort, okay? So you get a bunch of guys out there who a sergeant says, I want you to go out there and stop crime. What's the only way a street officer has to do something like that? And the answer is car stops. That's it. That's the only way you have a connection with the citizens, okay? So when you get stopped for just a simple traffic ticket, you have reason to be concerned because that's the portal, as I say in the book, to the electronic plantation. And so what happens is all of these folks are out there. They are highly incentivized, not just by the government, but just by a team sport. And so, and remember, when you're, and it's hard, I don't mean to suggest that women are any less police officers, but I think it helps when people understand that the bulk of street cops are, of course, boys, and we love to chase. We love to chase. We love to catch. We love to do boy things, okay? And so the result is that it fits perfectly with being a police. You get a red light and a siren, somebody flees from you, you can chase them, get out of your car, run them down, tackle them. Man, that is boy stuff.
No doubt.
And the consequence is that we have forgotten that the mission shouldn't be that. And it's encouraged by the supervisors.
Dale, we are unfortunately up against the clock. I highly recommend that everybody read your book, Arrest Proof Yourself, especially those who have teenagers. I want you to know I have had the talk with my kids. I have introduced them to your book because there's some very important information in there. Do you have a website that you would direct our listeners to if they want to find out a little bit more about you?
I do. It's dalecarsonlaw.com. And I'm in the process of writing another book which will help supervisory personnel in the departments refocus the energies of law enforcement into more productive areas. When we think about it, there are only about 5 crimes that we're concerned with. And those 5 crimes are rape, murder, aggravated assault, robbery, things like that, nighttime burglary.
Weeds growing a little too tall in your front yard,
Yeah, none of that matters. None of that. Some guy driving at night without a license, when I lay my head down on my pillow, I couldn't care less. But the other guys I care about. And the only way to get to them is to use bait. And that really is the subject of my next book, which deals with those very issues and encourages law enforcement to move forward to better protect American citizens.
Dale, we are looking forward to our next conversation with you, and we'll be watching anxiously for the release of your next book. Thanks again for visiting with us.
My pleasure, gentlemen. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Dale.
Okay, so we'll have the information about Dale and his book posted on our show notes page, which you can reach at societyandthestate.com/5. And we'll see you on our next episode.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.